Have you ever been in a situation where someone kept hurting you, but every time you tried to express your pain, they told you it was just a joke? Where your feelings were constantly invalidized, dismissed as if you were the problem for not having a sense of humor? Well, let me tell you about the time I decided to stop arguing and start documenting, and how that simple decision changed everything in my life. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what matters is what happened to me, and I'm sharing this because I know somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that they're not crazy. They're not too sensitive, and they're definitely not petty for wanting to be treated with basic respect. This is the story of how I kept every single receipt from my ex-girlfriend's so-called pranks, and how she laughed at me for being petty until the moment the total came due. I never imagined that love could transform into something so toxic, so quietly devastating that you don't even realize you're drowning until you're gasping for air. But that's exactly what happened to me, and it started so innocently, so gradually, that by the time I understood what was happening, I had already lost thousands of dollars, my peace of mind, and nearly my sense of self-worth. I remember the exact moment when everything shifted in my perspective. It was a Tuesday evening, ordinary in every way except for what it would come to represent. I was sitting on my couch, staring at yet another credit card statement, my hands trembling slightly as I calculated the damage from her latest prank. $347 for a designer handbag she had ordered using my card as a joke, she said, to see my reaction when the package arrived. She thought it was hilarious. I thought it was theft, but I didn't say that out loud because I had learned by then that speaking up only made me the villain in her narrative. I had become the person with no sense of humor, the uptight boyfriend who couldn't take a joke, the petty one who kept score of everything. But here's the thing about being called petty when you're actually just trying to survive someone else's idea of entertainment. Eventually, you start to wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe you are too sensitive. Maybe you do need to lighten up. Maybe love is supposed to hurt a little bit, and you're just not evolved enough to understand that. That's what emotional manipulation does to you. It makes you question your own reality, your own feelings, your own very valid reactions to being mistreated. And I fell for it over and over again, until that Tuesday evening when something inside me finally clicked. I picked up my phone, opened a new note, and I typed the date, the item, and the amount. Then I went back through my statements, through my texts, through my emails, and I started documenting everything. Every single prank that had cost me money, every joke that had come at my expense, every time she had laughed while I was left dealing with the consequences. I didn't tell her what I was doing. I didn't announce my intentions. I just quietly, methodically, started building a case, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed proof. Proof that I wasn't imagining things. Proof that this wasn't normal. Proof that I had every right to feel the way I felt. What started as a relationship full of laughter and joy had somehow morphed into a twisted game where I was always the punchline, always the target, always the one left holding the bill while she moved on to planning her next hilarious surprise. And the worst part? She made me feel like I was the problem for not appreciating her creativity, her spontaneity, her unique sense of humor. But as I sat there that evening, building my spreadsheet of pain, I realized something profound. Keeping receipts isn't petty when someone is systematically taking advantage of you. Documentation isn't vindictive when you're trying to protect yourself. And standing up for yourself isn't being dramatic when someone has spent months making you feel small. I had no idea yet where this would lead. No master plan for confrontation. No fantasy of justice being served. I just knew that I needed to stop gaslighting myself on her behalf. I needed to see, in black and white numbers, whether my feelings were justified or whether I really was just being the oversensitive, humorless person she kept telling me I was. And as the list grew longer, as the numbers got bigger, as the pattern became undeniable, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Validation. Cold, hard, numerical validation that what was happening to me was real, was wrong, and was absolutely not something I should continue to tolerate. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To really understand how I ended up sitting on that couch, documenting financial abuse disguised as pranks, I need to take you back to the beginning, to the moment when I first met her and thought I had found someone special, someone who would never hurt me, the way she eventually did. I met Sarah on a warm September evening at a friend's rooftop party, one of those magical nights where the city lights twinkle below and everything feels possible. She was standing by the edge, laughing at something someone had said, and her laughter was infectious, the kind that makes you want to be part of the joke even before you know what it is. I was immediately drawn to her energy, her confidence, the way she seemed to light up every space she occupied. When we finally talked, I was captivated by her wit, her intelligence, her ability to find humor in everything. She told me about her job in marketing, about her love for spontaneous adventures, about how life was too short to be boring. I remember thinking that she was exactly the kind of person I needed in my life. Someone who could pull me out of my sometimes too serious nature. Someone who could teach me to be more playful, more present, more alive. Our first date was unconventional and perfect. She surprised me by showing up at my apartment with 2 tickets to a midnight showing of a cult classic film I had mentioned loving. She had brought popcorn, candy, and a blanket because she said the theater was always freezing. It was thoughtful, spontaneous, and exactly the kind of romantic gesture that made me fall for her even harder. The first 3 months were a whirlwind of adventure and affection. She would surprise me with small gifts, spontaneous road trips, and creative date ideas that kept our relationship feeling fresh and exciting. I loved how unpredictable she was, how she could turn an ordinary Tuesday into an adventure. I loved the way she challenged me to step outside my comfort zone, to try new things, to embrace spontaneity. Looking back now with the clarity that only hindsight provides, I can see that the seeds of what would later become a nightmare were planted during those early, intoxicating days. Her spontaneity wasn't always thoughtful. Sometimes it was impulsive and inconsiderate of my schedule or preferences. Her surprises weren't always welcome. Sometimes they created stress or inconvenience that I brushed aside because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. Her humor occasionally had an edge to it, a subtle mockery that I laughed along with because I wanted to be the cool boyfriend who could take a joke. But in those early days, I was too enchanted to notice the warning signs, too caught up in the excitement of new love to recognize that some of her behaviors were testing boundaries, pushing limits, seeing how much I would tolerate in the name of being easygoing and fun. The first actual prank happened about 4 months into our relationship. I woke up one morning to find my car completely wrapped in plastic wrap, the kind you use for food storage, layer upon layer of it covering every inch of my vehicle. Sarah was there, filming my reaction, laughing hysterically as I stood in my driveway in my pajamas, coffee cup in hand, staring at what would take me almost 2 hours to unwrap before I could drive to work. I was late to an important meeting. I was frustrated and embarrassed. But when I tried to express my annoyance, she looked at me with such genuine confusion and hurt that I immediately felt guilty. She told me it was just a prank, that she had seen it online and thought it would be funny, that she didn't realize I would take it so seriously. She said she was sorry if I couldn't see the humor in it, but that she thought I was more laid back than this. And just like that, my legitimate frustration was reframed as a character flaw, a failure on my part to be the fun, spontaneous person she thought I was. I apologized to her for being upset. I actually apologized for having a normal human reaction to being pranked in a way that made me late for work. And she accepted my apology with a kiss and a promise that next time she would make sure her pranks didn't interfere with my schedule. I thought that was the end of it, that we had communicated and resolved the issue like adults. I had no idea that next time was already being planned in her head, and that the pranks would only get more elaborate, more expensive, and more difficult to laugh off as harmless fun. The plastic wrap incident cost me nothing except time and dignity, but it established a pattern that would define our relationship for the next year and a half. She would do something that upset or inconvenienced me. I would react with understandable frustration, and then she would make me feel like my reaction was the real problem, not her actions. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I didn't even realize I was being enrolled. The pranks continued, each one carefully calibrated to walk the line between funny and harmful, between creative and cruel. She would rearrange all my furniture while I was at work, claiming she was helping me see my space with fresh eyes. She would change all my phone contacts to ridiculous names so that when my boss called, my phone would display something embarrassing. She would post unflattering photos of me on social media with captions that were meant to be funny, but always made me feel exposed and vulnerable. And every single time when I expressed discomfort or asked her to stop, she would tell me I was being too sensitive, that I needed to learn to laugh at myself, that this was just her love language, and if I really loved her, I would appreciate her efforts to keep things fun and exciting. I found myself walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next prank would strike, always slightly anxious about what surprise awaited me. And the worst part was that she had convinced our friends, her family, and even some of my own family members that she was this quirky, creative, fun-loving girlfriend who was trying to bring joy into the life of her too serious boyfriend. I became the straight man in her comedy routine, and everyone was laughing except me. Have you ever felt like you're living in a reality that everyone else interprets completely differently than you do? Like you're experiencing pain, but everyone around you insists you should be grateful? That's what those months felt like. I was drowning in a relationship that everyone else thought looked perfect from the outside. The pranks started costing me money about 6 months in, and that's when things shifted from annoying to financially damaging, though I didn't fully recognize it at first because the amount started small and the justifications were always so creative. The first financial prank was what she called a subscription surprise. I came home one day to find confirmation emails for subscriptions to services I had never heard of, all charged to my credit card. There was a monthly wine club, an artisanal cheese delivery service, a streaming platform for foreign films, a meditation app, and an online course about cryptocurrency investing. The total monthly cost was about $230. And when I discovered it, Sarah was sitting on my couch with a huge smile, waiting for my reaction. She explained that she had noticed I was stressed lately and thought these subscriptions would enrich my life, help me relax, expose me to new experiences. She had used my credit card because she wanted it to be a surprise, and she knew if she told me about it first, I would say no because I'm too practical. She spun it as a gift, an act of love, a way of taking care of me. But here's the thing. She never asked if I wanted any of these things. She never considered whether I had the budget for an extra $230 a month. She never thought about the fact that using someone's credit card without permission is, legally speaking, fraud. But when I pointed out these concerns, I was once again the bad guy, the ungrateful boyfriend who couldn't appreciate a thoughtful gesture, the penny pincher who was more concerned with money than with the loving intention behind her actions. I ended up keeping most of the subscriptions for 2 months because canceling them felt like rejecting her gift, like confirming her accusation that I was too uptight and unappreciative. By the time I finally canceled them all, I had spent over $400 on services I never wanted and barely used. But it didn't stop there. The financial pranks escalated in both frequency and cost. There was the time she ordered $100 worth of pizza delivery to my office during a serious work presentation, claiming she thought I would find it funny and that my coworkers would love her for it. Instead, I was mortified and had to pay for pizzas I didn't order while apologizing to my boss for the disruption. There was the time she bought an expensive espresso machine on my Amazon account as a prank because I had jokingly complained about my coffee maker one time. $450 for a joke I didn't find funny. There was the time she booked a surprise weekend trip for us using my credit card, then got upset when I couldn't take the time off work because I had a major deadline. She went anyway, with her friends on my dime, and told me I was ruining her fun by being such a workaholic. That trip cost me $1,200. Each time the pattern was the same. She would do something that cost me money without my permission or knowledge. I would discover it and feel upset. She would frame it as a surprise, a gift, a joke, an expression of love or creativity. I would try to explain why it wasn't okay. She would make me feel like I was the problem for not appreciating her spontaneity and generosity. And I would end up apologizing for being upset while quietly absorbing the financial hit. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each one small enough to justify, large enough to hurt, and frequent enough that I never had time to recover before the next one struck. I started to feel anxious every time I checked my bank account or credit card statements. I started to dread the moment when she would get that particular gleam in her eye that signaled another prank was being planned. I started to feel like I had no control over my own financial life, my own decisions, my own boundaries. And through it all, she maintained this narrative that she was the fun, creative, loving girlfriend, and I was the boring, controlling, petty boyfriend who cared more about money than about our relationship. She told this story so convincingly that I started to believe it myself. Maybe I was too focused on money. Maybe I needed to be more spontaneous. Maybe this was just what relationships looked like when you dated someone more adventurous than yourself. But deep down, in a place I was trying very hard to ignore, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. I knew that love shouldn't feel like financial ruin. I knew that pranks shouldn't leave you feeling violated and disrespected. I knew that spontaneity shouldn't translate to someone else spending your money without permission. But knowing something and having the courage to act on that knowledge are two very different things, especially when you're being systematically conditioned to doubt your own perceptions and feelings. So I stayed, and the pranks continued, and the costs accumulated, and my resentment grew even as I tried to suppress it, to be the easygoing guy she insisted I should be, to laugh along with everyone else even though I was the only one who could feel the knife cutting deeper with each joke. The breaking point came on what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life, and the cruelty of that timing still takes my breath away when I think about it. I had been working on a major project at work for almost a year, pouring countless hours into a presentation that could potentially earn me a significant promotion and raise. It was the kind of opportunity that comes once in a career, the kind that could change your financial trajectory and validate years of hard work and sacrifice. I had told Sarah about this presentation weeks in advance, had explained how important it was, had asked her to please not plan anything that day because I needed to focus entirely on this career-defining moment. She had seemed to understand, had been supportive, had even wished me luck that morning with a kiss and a promise that she would be thinking of me. The presentation was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. At 11:30, while I was doing my final preparations, I got a call from my landlord. She was confused and concerned because a moving company had shown up at my apartment building with a truck and movers, claiming they had been hired to move all of my belongings to a storage unit. My landlord had stopped them, unsure if this was legitimate or some kind of scam. My heart dropped into my stomach. I called Sarah immediately, panic rising in my throat. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear the laughter in her voice before she even spoke. She had hired the movers as a prank, she explained, giggling as she told me about how she had planned this elaborate joke where I would think I was being evicted or robbed, and then she would reveal it was all just a surprise prank. She thought it would be hilarious to see my reaction. She had no idea that the movers had actually shown up, that my landlord had gotten involved, that I was now dealing with this crisis less than 3 hours before the most important presentation of my life. I begged her to call the moving company and cancel everything. She said she would, still laughing, still not quite understanding why I was so upset. I had to leave work, drive home, apologize to my landlord, apologize to the confused movers, and then try to pull myself together enough to return to the office and deliver a presentation that required me to be calm, confident, and focused. I was none of those things. My hands were shaking. My mind was racing. Every time I tried to focus on my presentation notes, I would see the image of strangers preparing to load all my belongings into a truck, and I would feel that stomach-dropping panic all over again. The presentation was a disaster. I stumbled over words, lost my place, failed to answer questions with the clarity and expertise I had spent months preparing. I could see the disappointment in my boss's face, could feel the opportunity slipping away with every fumbled response. I didn't get the promotion. The opportunity went to a colleague who had been prepared, focused, and unshaken by his girlfriend's idea of humor. When I confronted Sarah that evening, I was angrier than I had ever been in our relationship. I didn't yell, but my voice was shaking as I explained what her prank had cost me, not just in terms of the money she had paid the movers, but in terms of the opportunity I had lost, the impression I had made on my superiors, the damage to my professional reputation. I told her that this had crossed a line, that her pranks had gone too far, that I needed her to understand that her actions had real consequences that affected my life in serious ways. She cried. She said she had no idea the movers would actually show up that early, that she had planned for them to arrive after my presentation, so it would be funny instead of stressful. She said she was just trying to do something memorable, something that would make a story we could laugh about later. She said she loved me and would never intentionally sabotage something important to me. And then, after her tears and apologies, she said something that I will never forget, something that crystallized everything that was wrong with our relationship into a single sentence. She said with genuine confusion in her voice that she didn't understand why I was being so petty about a stupid joke when she had already said she was sorry. Petty. That word hung in the air between us like a verdict. After everything she had done, after the financial drain, after the stress, after costing me a career opportunity that I had worked toward for a year, I was being petty for being upset. And in that moment, something inside me broke. Not the loud, dramatic kind of breaking that comes with shouting and door slamming and declarations of being done. The quiet kind. The kind where you realize that you have been trying to make someone understand something they are fundamentally incapable or unwilling to understand. The kind where you accept that you cannot reason with someone who views your pain as an overreaction and your boundaries as evidence of your character flaws. That night, after she left in tears, offended that I hadn't accepted her apology with immediate forgiveness, I sat down and I started documenting. Not because I was plotting revenge or planning a dramatic confrontation, but because I needed to know the truth. I needed to see, objectively, whether I was really being petty or whether I had been systematically manipulated into accepting unacceptable treatment while being told it was love. The process of documentation became my anchor to reality, my way of fighting back against the constant gaslighting without actually fighting, without confronting, without opening myself up to being told once again that I was the problem. I created a detailed spreadsheet with columns for date, description of the prank, financial cost, time cost, and emotional impact. I went through my bank statements, credit card bills, emails, texts, and even my calendar, to reconstruct a comprehensive history of every prank that had cost me money or significant inconvenience. The exercise was eye-opening in ways I hadn't anticipated. When you experience manipulative behavior in real time, it's easy to minimize each individual incident, to tell yourself that it wasn't that bad, that you're overreacting, that this one thing doesn't justify ending a relationship. But when you see them all listed together, when you watch the pattern emerge across months of documented incidents, when you calculate the actual total cost of someone's idea of entertainment, reality becomes undeniable. I included everything. The plastic wrap on my car, which cost me nothing financially, but made me 2 hours late to work, and earned me a warning from my boss. Value assigned, professional reputation damage. The subscription surprise, which cost me $460 over 2 months. The office pizza incident, which cost me $103 plus embarrassment in front of my colleagues and supervisors. The espresso machine I never wanted, $450. The surprise trip she took with her friends on my credit card, $1,200. The moving company prank, which cost me $275 in fees even after cancellation, plus the promotion I didn't get because I bombed the presentation. How do you put a dollar value on a lost promotion? I conservatively estimated it cost me at least $10,000 in lost salary increase over the year. I would have been in that higher position before my next review opportunity. But I didn't include that in my official tally because I knew she would argue that I couldn't prove the prank was the only reason I didn't get promoted. There was the time she bought an expensive necklace using my credit card and then gifted it to her mother for her birthday, telling her family that we had bought it together. $320. The time she signed me up for a gym membership at an expensive boutique fitness center as a prank about my New Year's resolutions. First month paid in full, $190 before I could cancel. The time she bought concert tickets for both of us to see a band she liked using my card, then got mad when I couldn't go due to work obligations and took her ex instead. $240. The time she ordered a custom cake shaped like a toilet to be delivered to my office for my birthday because she thought bathroom humor was hilarious. $75 and complete mortification. The time she booked a luxury spa day for herself and 3 friends using my card because she wanted to show them how generous her boyfriend was. $680. The time she bought an expensive video game console that she wanted because she claimed it was really for both of us to enjoy together, except she was the only one who ever used it. $510. The list went on and on, each entry a small violation, a boundary crossed. A moment where my financial autonomy was treated as a toy for her amusement. As I documented each incident, I remembered not just the money, but the feelings. The anxiety of checking my accounts, the dread of discovering what she had done this time, the exhaustion of having to explain again why this wasn't okay, the futility of those explanations when she would inevitably turn it around to make me the problem. I included detailed notes about each incident, including my reaction, her response, and the aftermath. I noted every time I had tried to set a boundary, every time she had dismissed my concerns, every time she had called me too sensitive or petty or boring or controlling. I documented the pattern of her apologizing only to repeat the same behavior days or weeks later. I tracked how the financial pranks had escalated over time, starting with smaller amounts and building to larger and more significant costs. The total, when I finally added it all up, was staggering. Over the course of 18 months, Sarah's pranks had cost me $7,362 in direct expenses that I could prove with receipts and statements. That number didn't include the lost promotion, the therapy I had started attending to deal with my anxiety about the relationship, the social costs of being embarrassed in front of friends and colleagues, or the emotional toll of being in a relationship where I constantly felt disrespected and dismissed. $7,362. That's not a small amount of money. That's a used car. That's a down payment on furniture for a first apartment. That's dozens of student loan payments. That's months of groceries. That's the emergency fund I had been trying to build but could never seem to grow because unexpected expenses kept depleting it. Except they weren't unexpected. They were pranks I should have never had to pay for in the first place. Seeing that number was like being punched in the stomach and freed from chains at the same time. The punch because it was so much more than I had realized, because I had been losing so much while being told I was petty for caring about money at all. The freedom because here, finally, was proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't overreacting, wasn't the problem. Here was objective evidence that what was happening to me was financial abuse disguised as playfulness, manipulation disguised as spontaneity, cruelty disguised as humor. The confrontations I had attempted before my documentation project were frustrating exercises in circular logic and emotional manipulation that left me feeling more confused and guilty than validated. Every single time I tried to express my discomfort with her pranks, Sarah had a toolkit of responses designed to deflect responsibility and redirect blame back onto me. She had perfected the art of the non-apology, the kind that sounds like remorse but actually contains no acknowledgement of wrongdoing and no commitment to change. Her favorite phrases became triggers for me. "I'm sorry you feel that way," instead of, "I'm sorry for what I did." I was just trying to have fun, as if intent somehow negated impact. "You know I would never hurt you on purpose." As if accidentally destructive behavior done repeatedly wasn't just as harmful as intentional malice. "This is just who I am, and if you love me, you'll accept me." As if love required accepting mistreatment. I tried everything to make her understand. I tried calm, rational conversations where I explained using I statements and non-accusatory language exactly how her actions made me feel. She would listen with a patient expression that I later recognized as condescension, and then she would explain back to me why my feelings were based on a misunderstanding of her intentions. I tried emotional vulnerability, opening up about my anxiety and stress, and asking her to consider the impact of her actions on my mental health. She would comfort me, promise to be more mindful, and then prank me again within days, seemingly having forgotten the entire conversation. I tried setting explicit boundaries, clearly stating what I was and wasn't comfortable with regarding surprises and pranks. She would agree to respect those boundaries, and then she would violate them while claiming that this particular prank didn't count, because it was different in some technical way from what we had discussed. I tried involving friends, hoping that outside perspective would help her see reason. But she had already shaped the narrative with our social circle, painting herself as the fun, spontaneous girlfriend and me as the uptight, controlling boyfriend. So our friends would laugh awkwardly and suggest we work it out between ourselves, clearly thinking I was making a big deal out of nothing. I tried couples counseling, suggesting that maybe a therapist could help us communicate better. She refused, saying that therapy was for people with real problems, and we didn't need to pay someone to tell us how to have fun in our relationship, which she claimed was the only issue, that I had forgotten how to have fun. What I didn't try, until I started documenting, was believing my own experience over her interpretation of it. That was the revelation that changed everything. For so long, I had been trying to make her understand, to convince her, to get her to validate my feelings and acknowledge her behavior. But you can't reason someone into respecting you if they benefit from not respecting you. You can't explain someone into treating you better if they've decided that mistreating you is entertaining. You can't communicate your way out of a relationship with someone who views your boundaries as challenges to overcome rather than limits to respect. The documentation wasn't about preparing for a confrontation, though it would eventually lead to one. The documentation was about saving my own sanity, proving to myself that I wasn't imagining things, creating a record that would stand independent of her reinterpretation and my own exhausted tendency to minimize and excuse. Every time she called me petty after that night when she ruined my presentation, I would open that spreadsheet and look at the numbers. $7,362. That's not petty. That's not sensitive. That's not making a big deal out of nothing. That's a pattern of financial abuse that I had every right to be upset about. But I still didn't confront her with it. Not yet. Because part of me, the part that had been conditioned by 18 months of gaslighting, was still afraid that somehow she would find a way to make the spreadsheet my fault too. That she would accuse me of being calculating and vindictive for keeping track. That she would twist my documentation into evidence of my controlling nature, rather than evidence of her harmful behavior. So I kept it to myself, this secret record of truth, and I watched. I watched as she planned more pranks, though I noticed they had decreased slightly in frequency after the moving truck disaster. I watched as she tested my boundaries in new ways, seeing if I had really been changed by that confrontation, or if I would eventually relax back into my usual accommodating self. I watched as she told our friends funny stories about her pranks, stories that left out the costs and consequences, stories that made everyone laugh while I smiled tightly and said nothing, because correcting her would make me look like the fun ruiner she always said I was. And I watched myself, monitored my own reactions, paid attention to my own feelings, and realized that I was not happy. I hadn't been happy in a very long time. I had been anxious, stressed, financially drained, emotionally exhausted, and constantly walking on eggshells trying to avoid triggering the next prank or the next accusation that I was too sensitive. That's not what love is supposed to feel like. Love isn't supposed to make you dread checking your bank account or coming home to surprises that aren't really gifts, but tests of how much you'll tolerate while still claiming to love someone. The accumulation of evidence in my spreadsheet paralleled the accumulation of resentment in my heart, both growing steadily as weeks passed, and Sarah's behavior showed no signs of meaningful change, despite her promises after the presentation disaster. She had become slightly more careful, it's true, but careful in a way that felt more like covering her tracks than actually respecting my boundaries. The pranks continued, just smaller, more frequent, death by 1,000 paper cuts instead of occasional stab wounds. There was the morning I woke up to find she had replaced all my regular clothes in my closet with ridiculous costumes she had bought from a thrift store, meaning I had to dig through my laundry to find something appropriate to wear to work, making me late again. Cost: $47 for the costumes I would never use, plus another mark against my professional reputation. There was the time she changed my email signature to something embarrassing without telling me, so I sent professional emails to clients and colleagues with "living my best life, one prank at a time," as my signature for 2 full days before someone pointed it out. Cost: immeasurable professional embarrassment, and another conversation with my boss about maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal and professional life. There was the time she ordered a singing telegram to be delivered to me during a serious meeting with a potential client. Cost: $95 for the telegram, plus the client deal that fell through because the interruption made us seem unprofessional. There was the time she posted a video of me sleeping with my mouth open and snoring on social media, tagged me and all my professional connections, with a caption about how cute I was when I wasn't being so serious. Cost: my dignity and several uncomfortable conversations with colleagues who had seen the video. Each incident on its own was small enough to be dismissed as minor, forgivable, not worth ending a relationship over. But together, they formed a picture of someone who either couldn't or wouldn't respect my clearly stated boundaries, someone who prioritized her own entertainment over my comfort, someone who viewed my reactions to her behavior as the problem rather than the behavior itself. And through it all, she maintained her narrative that I was being petty for keeping score, for not letting things go, for bringing up past incidents when we had already talked about them. But here's what I learned during those months of documentation and accumulation. When someone repeatedly does the same harmful thing after promising not to, bringing up past incidents isn't holding grudges, it's identifying patterns. When someone systematically violates your boundaries while calling you sensitive for having them, keeping score isn't petty, it's survival. When someone's actions consistently contradict their words, documentation isn't vindictive, it's evidence. I started to notice other patterns too, ones I had been too close to see before. Sarah's pranks always seemed to happen when something good occurred in my life independently of her. Got praise from my boss? Time for a prank that would embarrass me at work? Making progress on a personal project? Time for a prank that would disrupt my focus and schedule? Reconnecting with old friends she hadn't met? Time for a prank that would dominate the conversation and make the gathering about her and her creativity instead of about my relationships. It was as if she couldn't tolerate me having sources of confidence, success, or joy that didn't include her, so she would sabotage them in ways that could be dismissed as playful, but had the effect of keeping me destabilized and dependent on her approval. This realization was painful, because it meant acknowledging that the person I loved might not actually have my best interests at heart, might actually be threatened by my independence and success, might actually prefer me slightly broken and manageable rather than confident and self-assured. I shared some of my concerns with my best friend Marcus one evening over beers. I didn't tell him about the spreadsheet, but I described some of the recent incidents and admitted that I was feeling increasingly unhappy and trapped. Marcus listened quietly, and then he said something that has stuck with me ever since. He said, "Man, you keep calling them pranks, but pranks are supposed to be funny for everyone involved, not just the person doing them. What you're describing sounds more like bullying with a laugh track." Bullying with a laugh track. That phrase cut through all the confusion and justification and gave me words for what I had been experiencing but couldn't name. Sarah wasn't pranking me, she was bullying me. And every time I reacted with hurt or anger, she weaponized the framework of pranks to make my reactions seem unreasonable. After all, who gets mad about a harmless joke? Who can't take a prank? Who's so serious that they can't laugh at themselves? The answer: someone who is being systematically mistreated and then blamed for noticing. My spreadsheet had grown to include 43 separate incidents over 18 months. The total had climbed to $7,362, but the emotional cost was impossible to calculate. How do you quantify the anxiety of never feeling safe in your own relationship? How do you put a number on the erosion of trust? How do you measure the cost of being made to feel crazy for having normal reactions to abnormal treatment? I still hadn't confronted her with my documentation. I think part of me was waiting for the final straw, the incident so undeniable that even she couldn't spin it, so severe that I would have the courage to actually end things rather than just documenting how bad they were. I was building a case, yes, but I was also building courage. Evidence that I could point to when I inevitably doubted myself. Proof that would sustain me through the breakup and its aftermath, when she would surely tell everyone that I was heartless and cold for ending things over her, just trying to have fun. The final straw came on a day that should have been sacred, untouchable. The one day that I thought even Sarah would recognize as off-limits for her brand of entertainment. My father had been sick for several months, battling cancer with the kind of quiet courage that defined his entire approach to life, never complaining, always trying to protect his family from worry, even as he underwent brutal treatment. I had been driving 3 hours every weekend to visit him, to sit with him during chemo, to help my mother with the overwhelming logistics of illness. Sarah had met my parents several times, had been welcomed into family gatherings, had heard me talk about my fear of losing my father and my gratitude for every moment I still had with him. When my mother called me at work on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me that Dad had taken a turn for the worse and I should come as soon as possible, I left immediately, texting Sarah on my way to my apartment to grab my overnight bag. She responded with supportive messages, saying she was thinking of me and my family, asking if there was anything she could do, telling me to drive safely. I appreciated the support, felt grateful that at least in this moment of crisis, she was being the partner I needed. I grabbed my bag, jumped in my car, and started the 3-hour drive to my parents' house with a knot of fear in my stomach and prayers on my lips that I would get there in time, that I wouldn't have to say goodbye over a phone, that my father would know I loved him. About an hour into the drive, my phone started blowing up with notifications. Text messages, calls, voicemails, all from Sarah, all marked urgent. My first thought was that something had happened to her, some emergency that needed my attention. I pulled over at a rest stop and called her back, my heart pounding with adrenaline and dread. She answered laughing, actually laughing. And then she said the words that ended our relationship right there in that moment, though it would take me another week to make it official. She said, "Did you find it yet? Check your bag. I put a surprise in there for you." I was confused, scared, and increasingly angry. I told her I didn't have time for this, that I was on my way to see my dying father and whatever prank she had planned needed to wait. She giggled and said, "Just look in your bag. I promise you'll laugh. I put something in there to cheer you up during a hard time." With shaking hands and a sense of dread, I opened my overnight bag. Inside, among my clothes and toiletries, I found a massive rainbow-colored dildo, a bottle of edible underwear, and a card that read, "For when you need to fuck your feelings away." I stared at these items in my bag, items I would have to explain to my conservative, religious, dying father if he or anyone else in my family happened to see inside my bag, and something inside me just shut down. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, final, absolute way. The part of me that had been trying to understand her, to see things from her perspective, to give her the benefit of the doubt, to believe that she loved me despite her actions, that part just stopped functioning. I took the items out of my bag, threw them in a trash can at the rest stop, and I called her back. My voice was calm, cold, empty of all the emotion that had been there minutes before. I told her, "We're done. Don't contact me again. I'll deal with getting my things and settling everything else after my father dies or recovers. But we are absolutely finished." She tried to laugh it off, saying I was overreacting, that it was just a joke to lighten the mood, that she had no idea I would be so sensitive about it, that I was being dramatic and hurtful by breaking up with her over text when she was just trying to help. I hung up on her mid-sentence and blocked her number. Then I sat in my car in that rest stop parking lot and I cried. Not just for my father and the fear of losing him, but for the 18 months I had wasted with someone who would think that sexually explicit gag gifts were appropriate for a family emergency, who would try to turn my drive to my father's deathbed into another opportunity for her amusement, who could laugh while I was in pain and call it help. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I pulled myself together, wiped my face, and continued driving. I made it to the hospital in time. My father stabilized, went through another round of treatment, and eventually went into remission, though the scare aged both him and my mother in ways that broke my heart. I never told them about Sarah's final prank. There was no point. They had enough to deal with without knowing that their son's girlfriend had been that callous during one of our family's darkest moments. The reckoning came exactly 1 week after I ended things, and it unfolded in a way I hadn't planned, but that felt inevitable once it started. like watching dominoes fall after years of carefully stacking them. Sarah had not respected my request for no contact. She had texted from different numbers, sent messages through mutual friends, even shown up at my apartment twice before I threatened to call the police. She was spinning a narrative to anyone who would listen about how I had cruelly dumped her without explanation, how I had overreacted to a harmless joke, how I was being vindictive and cold. Our mutual friends were caught in the middle, getting her version of events and asking me what had really happened, clearly skeptical that someone would end a 1.5-year relationship over a prank. I had been staying quiet, focusing on my father's recovery and my own emotional healing, trying to take the high road and simply move on with my life. But Sarah escalated. She started a social media campaign of sorts, posting vague messages about narcissistic partners who can't take a joke, about loving someone who throws away a relationship over nothing, about being the victim of someone who was controlling and financially abusive to her. That last accusation, the projection of her own behavior onto me, was what broke my silence. She had convinced herself and was trying to convince everyone else that I was the abuser, that my careful budgeting and reluctance to let her spend my money freely was financial abuse, that my boundaries were control, that my documentation was evidence of my vindictiveness rather than her misconduct. I realized then that staying quiet wasn't protecting me or allowing me to move on peacefully. It was allowing her to control the narrative, to paint me as the villain, to set herself up as a sympathetic figure while I became the bad guy in a story she was writing. So I did something I had never intended to do. I shared the spreadsheet. Not publicly, not as a dramatic social media post, but strategically with the people who mattered, the mutual friends who were asking questions, the people who had witnessed some of the pranks and been told they were harmless, the individuals who were starting to pull away from me based on Sarah's version of events. I sent them a simple message. I haven't wanted to air private relationship details, but since Sarah is publicly accusing me of abuse, I need to share the actual facts. This is what happened during our relationship. This is why I ended things. This is not up for debate or discussion, but I need people to understand the truth. And then I attached the spreadsheet, every incident, dated and described, every cost, itemized and totaled, every attempt I made to set boundaries, every dismissal of my concerns, every time she called me petty for objecting to treatment that any reasonable person would find unacceptable. $7,362 over 18 months. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Friends who had been cool to me after the breakup suddenly understood. People who had laughed at her prank stories suddenly saw them in a different light when they understood the full context and consequences. Several people reached out to apologize for not taking my concerns seriously when I had tried to hint at problems during the relationship. 2 friends admitted they had their own concerning experiences with Sarah that they had dismissed as her being quirky, but seeing the pattern laid out made them realize those incidents were boundary violations too. One person told me that Sarah had once used his credit card without permission to buy drinks for a group at a bar, and when he got upset, she had called him cheap and said he was embarrassing her in front of her friends. He had paid the bill and never brought it up again, because she made him feel like he was being unreasonable. Marcus, my best friend who had first named what I was experiencing as bullying, told me he was proud of me for finally standing up for myself, but also sorry that I had endured so much for so long. He asked why I hadn't shown him the spreadsheet earlier, and I told him the truth, because part of me was still hoping I was wrong, that I was overreacting, that I wouldn't need the evidence because she would change, because documentation felt like giving up on the relationship, and I hadn't been ready to give up until she violated something I couldn't forgive. The spreadsheet also made its way to Sarah, of course. I don't know who sent it to her, but she responded exactly as I had expected. She called me obsessive and crazy for keeping such detailed records. She accused me of being calculating and vindictive. She said the spreadsheet proved I was controlling and abusive, that I had been keeping score throughout our entire relationship, instead of loving her freely. She claimed many of the incidents were exaggerated or taken out of context, though she couldn't deny the financial records that backed up every entry. She told people I was weaponizing her spontaneous, loving nature against her, that I was destroying her reputation to make myself feel better about being a bad partner. But here's the thing about truth. When you have evidence, when you have documentation, when you have receipts both literal and metaphorical, the people who matter will see through the smokescreen. Not everyone, of course. Some people still sided with Sarah, still believed her narrative, still thought I was overreacting or that surely there were 2 sides to every story. But the people who mattered, the people whose opinions I valued, the people who knew me well enough to recognize that keeping that spreadsheet was an act of self-preservation rather than vindictiveness, those people understood. And I realized I didn't need everyone to understand. I just needed to understand, to know that I wasn't crazy, wasn't petty, wasn't wrong for ending a relationship that was harming me even if it didn't look like traditional abuse from the outside. The spreadsheet was my proof, my validation, my evidence that I had every right to walk away and never look back. Looking back now, 6 months after that final confrontation and the end of that toxic relationship, I can see so many things with clarity that was impossible when I was living through it day by day. I can see how gradually Sarah eroded my boundaries and my sense of what was normal in a relationship, how she conditioned me to accept mistreatment by calling it love, how she weaponized my desire to be easygoing and fun against me. I can see how I participated in my own mistreatment by prioritizing her feelings over mine, by accepting her interpretations of events over my own experiences, by staying far longer than I should have because I was afraid of being seen as the bad guy for ending things. I learned some hard lessons through this experience, lessons I want to share because I know there are people out there right now in similar situations, wondering if they're overreacting, wondering if they're too sensitive, wondering if keeping track of how they're being hurt makes them petty or vindictive. First, trust your feelings. If something consistently makes you feel bad, if you're constantly walking on eggshells, if you're always anxious about what's coming next, those feelings are data. They're information about your reality that deserves to be taken seriously, regardless of how anyone else interprets the situation. Your emotional experience is valid even if other people don't understand it. Second, boundaries are not controlling, and having them doesn't make you uptight or boring. Boundaries are basic relationship requirements that define where you end and another person begins. Someone who consistently violates your boundaries while calling you sensitive for having them is not someone who respects you, no matter what they say about loving you. Love and respect are inseparable. You cannot truly love someone you don't respect, and you cannot truly respect someone whose boundaries you constantly violate. Third, documentation isn't petty when you're being systematically mistreated. It's survival. It's holding on to reality when someone is trying to convince you that your reality isn't valid. It's evidence that you can look at when you start to doubt yourself, proof that stands independent of interpretation and gaslighting. Keep your receipts literal and metaphorical, not because you're planning some dramatic confrontation, but because you need to remember the truth when someone is working very hard to make you forget it. Fourth, intent doesn't negate impact. Sarah probably didn't set out to financially abuse me or emotionally manipulate me. She probably genuinely thought her pranks were funny and my reactions were oversensitive. But her intentions don't matter when the impact was consistent harm. It doesn't matter if someone means well if they're hurting you, and it's not your job to keep sacrificing your well-being for someone else's good intentions. Fifth, you are not responsible for managing other people's emotions about your boundaries. When I ended things with Sarah, she was hurt and angry and felt wronged. Those were her feelings, and they were valid for her, but they didn't obligate me to stay in a relationship that was harming me. You can have compassion for someone's pain while still maintaining your boundaries. You can acknowledge that your decisions affect others while still making decisions that prioritize your own well-being. Sixth, not everyone will understand your reasons for leaving, and that's okay. You don't need consensus to protect yourself. You don't need everyone to agree that you were mistreated in order to leave a situation that's not working for you. The only person who needs to understand why you're leaving is you. Seventh, and perhaps most importantly, love should not consistently feel like suffering. Relationships have hard moments, conflicts, challenges, absolutely. But the baseline should be respect, consideration, safety, and mutual support. If you find yourself constantly stressed, anxious, diminished, or walking on eggshells, something is fundamentally wrong regardless of whether anyone else sees it or whether the mistreatment fits conventional definitions of abuse. Trust yourself enough to leave situations that are harming you, even if you can't perfectly articulate why to others, even if it looks fine from the outside, even if leaving makes you the bad guy in someone else's story. I think about the total sometimes, $7,362, and I realize it was actually a bargain for the price of learning who I am, what I deserve, and what I will no longer tolerate. It was expensive education in self-respect, in boundaries, in recognizing manipulation disguised as playfulness. Would I prefer to have learned those lessons differently, to have that money back, to have those 18 months spent with someone who actually respected me? Of course. But I can't change the past, only learn from it. And what I learned is invaluable. I learned that I am not petty for expecting basic respect and financial autonomy in a relationship. I learned that documentation isn't evidence of being vindictive, but evidence of being honest about reality. I learned that standing up for myself, even when it makes someone else angry or sad, is not cruel, but necessary. I learned that the right person won't make me feel crazy for having boundaries. They'll respect those boundaries without me having to defend them constantly. I learned that I deserve better than someone who views my pain as an overreaction and my boundaries as challenges to overcome. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you found yourself in a relationship where you were constantly made to feel like the problem for having normal reactions to abnormal treatment? Have you kept receipts, literal or metaphorical, to hold on to reality when someone was trying to convince you that your reality was wrong? I want you to know that you're not alone, you're not crazy, and you're not petty for protecting yourself. Understanding that what happened to me was a form of abuse has been crucial to my healing and to ensuring I never accept that treatment again. It wasn't physical abuse, wasn't verbal abuse in the traditional screaming and name-calling sense, but it was abuse nonetheless. It was financial abuse disguised as pranks, emotional manipulation disguised as spontaneity, and systematic boundary violation disguised as love. Recognizing that has helped me set better boundaries in new relationships, spot warning signs earlier, and trust myself enough to walk away when something feels wrong, even if I can't perfectly explain why to everyone else. If this story touched you, if it resonated with your own experiences or opened your eyes to patterns in your own relationships, please leave a like on this video. Your engagement helps this story reach other people who might need to hear it, who might be sitting right now with their own spreadsheet of hurt, wondering if they're justified in being upset, who might need permission to trust their own feelings and leave situations that are harming them. And please comment below. Share your own experiences if you feel comfortable doing so. Tell me if you've ever been called petty for having boundaries. If you've ever kept receipts to validate your own reality. If you've ever been in a relationship where you were made to feel crazy for having normal reactions to mistreatment. Your stories matter, and sharing them creates community and understanding for all of us who have been through similar situations. If you want to hear more stories like this, real experiences from real people navigating the complicated terrain of relationships, self-respect, and personal growth, please subscribe to Living Through It and hit that notification bell. This channel is dedicated to sharing authentic stories that help us all feel less alone, understand our experiences better, and learn from each other's journeys. Every subscription, every like, every comment helps build a community of people who refuse to gaslight themselves on behalf of others, who believe in the validity of their own experiences, and who support each other in the difficult work of setting boundaries and demanding respect. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, keeping receipts isn't petty when someone is systematically taking advantage of you. Documentation is protection. Boundaries are love for yourself. And you absolutely deserve better than someone who calls you sensitive for expecting basic respect and consideration. You deserve better, and recognizing that is the first step toward actually getting better.